You know, whites, as I've indicated, think that they are nonviolent people. They will measure their levels of physical violence with black levels of physical violence. And as I said, they run a statistical game. And they'll often get away with it because people associate violence with physical interaction. You see, so we talk about violence and automatically we think of murder, killing, physical attacks and assault and so forth. But you see, when you're in power, there's another form of violence available to you. And when you're in power, you can call it by other names because power gives you the right also to define. And the power to define manipulates people's consciousness and blinds them to reality. And therefore, the ruling classes can appear to be even effeminate, nonviolent types. Wouldn't hurt a fly, but are yet the most violent people around. Because we cannot discount psychic violence. The violence against a person's mind. The violence against a person's perception of who he or she is. The violence that occurs from depriving a person of wholesome and healthy experiences that motivate and that provide the foundations for their healthy mental, social development as persons. Violence that motivates self-hatred. Violence that motivates alienation from the self and from the other. Violence that destroys initiative, that destroys persistence, that destroys the capacity of a community to organize itself socially and politically to act in its own interests. Violence that motivates many people then to engage in the self-destructive acts of drug addiction and other addictive forms of behavior. This is the most utter and the deepest violence of all. For often people can survive and respond and bounce back from physical violence. But the violence done to minds from the very first days of birth and from the very first years of life are extremely difficult to change. As a psychologist, as a person engaged in therapy, you come right up against the fact that it's usually those first 2, 3, 4, 5 years that are still working in a distorted personality. Those first 3, 4, 5 years that have driven a person insane, made them neurotic and maladjusted. And sometimes it takes almost another 3 or 4 or 5 years to even begin to get them on the path to healthy adjustment and behavior. A type of violence that breeds violence in itself and makes it appear that violence is self-initiated. And it's the type of violence, you see, that whites have visited on blacks so that they can stand back and say, we are not hurting them, we are not killing them, they're doing it to themselves because they've hidden the foundational violence, and that is the violence against the black consciousness and the black mind in such a way then that it expresses itself as black on black violence. This is the violence that comes, as we talked about earlier, from projecting black people as the major problem in this society. And this type of violence creates a sense of vulnerability and insecurity, a sense of dread and a sense of threat. It is this kind of violence that makes us wonder as black people if we are not slated for genocide. It creates then in us a state of mind, an offended sense of justice, an offended sense of self-image, self-esteem, self-confidence, a sense of powerlessness, a sense of incompetence, a sense of the inability to influence and control our environment, a sense of not being respected, a sense of social and self-alienation. And it is then the coming together of this state of mind with the material and other conditions I've enumerated earlier, this underlying anger and this underlying frustration, this underlying and chronic sense of self-dissatisfaction and dissatisfaction about the whole state of the country and of the world, that a seemingly small event in the eyesight of whites, the rendering of an obviously unjust decision, serves as a spark that leads to an explosion. But they take us as fools. They think that we have not registered all of the prior injustices. They take us to think that we have a memory that does not include those injustices, and one that says, you must stop here, and we're not going to let you go any further. We are going to end the injustices that you have been visiting upon us. These people think that they have set up a system of domination wherein they can hide their injustices. Except that domination itself is an injustice. I have to say one thing here, and I sort of have stated in other forums, when I've seen our people respond to Pennell and respond to the other injustices perpetrated by this government and by its courts, that we can march around these courthouses from now until doomsday. Ultimately, that is not going to change anything. While we must protest and let the system know that we object to injustice, we cannot let this be the end point of our protest, or else it will never stop. We will be protesting forever. Sometimes I'm a little disappointed by leaders who keep marching us around these courthouses and who keep talking about justice, no peace. Because there's this assumption that they can permit the white male to remain dominant in this system, that they can permit the white male to maintain his monopoly on power. And at some point, in some way, he will be just. They do not see the contradiction that it is injustice itself that is the foundation of a monopoly on power. That it is injustice that makes the monopoly on power and domination what? Possible. And that you cannot leave a people in power and with a monopoly on power unless you leave in place an unjust system. So ultimately, if you are to get justice, if we are to get justice, we must remove the white boy's ability to be unjust. Because as long as he has a monopoly on power, he must engage in injustice to maintain it. And this is the basis of my conferences on power. Some of you may have heard me at the slave theaters. I laid out this thesis. We may explain and reasons why whites are what they are and why they do what they do. We can talk about sun people and ice people. We can talk about people protecting their genes, and these theories have validity, so I'm not attacking their essence. We can lay out all kinds of explanations. But from my point of view, the reason why white folk do what they do is because they can. It's because they have the power to do so. And all our explorations as to why they are doing it, how they came to do it, and talking about their cold, icy natures, or talking about their protection of their genes is not going to change this fact. It is the nature of the power relationship between African American people and European American people that makes injustice possible. And therefore, if we are to end this injustice, we must end the power of these people to be unjust. And therefore, the thrust must not be asking them for justice, but breaking their arms and making their being unjust impossible. And consequently, the focus of our attention and energy then should be on the development of power and the creation of power. And instead of studying too deeply their psyches, we should study power as subject matter, its development, use, and application. For power is the very essence of life. No life is possible without it. And to ignore power, to ignore its development, to ignore its appropriate use, is to ignore life itself and ultimately invite death and destruction. We live in a system here where black people have been made to think that power is a dirty word, and that to discuss power and to talk about its cultivation is a sinful activity. Well, you must get over the propaganda that's created this attitude toward you. We will end it here then and recognize that the LA situations were types of revolutionary activities and possibly pointed to revolutionary change. Not all revolutionary acts or acts of revolt are successful in forcing policy changes, much less in overthrowing governments. Mass uprisings not aimed at revolutionary change, which have little or no ideological content, no plans for general reforms, are subject to failure. Revolts are easy targets. Such revolts, that is, revolts without ideological foundation, without ultimate plans and purposes. Such revolts are easy targets for existing power structures. The mass revolt without a social program, with limited leadership capabilities, and we are a community here that somehow just expect leaders to sprout up out of the ground instead of training them, and expect people to do the right thing instead of creating institutions to train and bring about the people to do the right thing and preparing them for doing the right things. Revolts generated by people who take this approach to power will produce then leadership with limited capabilities, cannot exploit its initial victories won in the first wild upsurge of hatred and resentment, or whatever you call it. You cannot what? Capitalize. I saw some people rejoicing in the Crown Heights disturbances, thinking at last the millennium had arrived, that out of this would grow a revolutionary change in New York. I'm sorry I had to object, because I did not see the ideological foundations that would become vehicles for that change. Victorious in the battlefield, its participants can only appeal to the ruling regime to set things right, to revert to the old just ways of doing things. And we see that again. After the riot is over, we even use the riots to plead. See, we told you we were in trouble. We told you wouldn't listen to us. Those kind of riots will not go anywhere. And hoping for more of them and talking about deferment will not take us anywhere unless they are ideologically rationalized and founded. In the circumstances of these riots or these so-called revolts, without ideological foundation, without a revolutionary rationale, without revolutionary goals, And by this I mean without the intent to reverse the power relationship in the society, to remove the power from the hands of white folk and white males and place that power in the hands of black males and in the hands of black people. This is what I'm talking about when I talk about revolution. A change in power relations. But that change has to be rationalized, and it's not motivated by just spontaneous reactions or reactionary behaviors, by reactionary protests, and then by trotting out a bunch of leaders who are going to feed on that and try to provoke guilt and this kind of stuff in the ruling establishment, and tries to get the ruling establishment now to minister unto them, to take the hard task of rationalizing our relationship to those in power with sound ideologies and sound rationales, and reorganizing our relationships one to the other. Because ultimately, power is a system. Power results from the alignment of people relative one to the other. Power then involves types of relationships people have one toward the other. Ultimately then, if we are to truly revolutionize this country and truly protect ourselves as a people, we must truly revolutionize our self-concept, our self-perception, revolutionize our history, and be committed to revolutionizing our future.